This presentation is designed to remind you of some important literary terms you've probably heard of before and their proper definitions, but also hopefully to introduce you to a few new ones or give you some new details or slightly more sophisticated definitions of terms you've heard of before. As we go through the presentation, please make sure to fill in the note sheet you got in class with the appropriate definitions so that you have a one-sheet sort of cheat sheet with all of the most important and most common terms. Write question marks or stars next to those that maybe you have a question about or for which my definition is slightly different from the one you've learned in the past, so when we review in class again, you remember to ask about that. We will start with plot, because plot is an essential component of any story. It is essentially just the series of events, the things that happen, the action. And in a traditional story, we talk about 5 parts of the story, usually in this order: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Exposition usually comes first, and it provides the background information or introduction. It's essentially the kind of information you need for the rest of the story to make sense. So if you've read a longer story about a family, in the first chapter, you might see them gathering at the breakfast table and everyone's talking about their day so that you quickly learn what grade the different children are in, what sports they're in. Maybe they make a reference to the weather so you know what time of year it is. Exposition just sets the scene. The rising action is the part of the story where complications and problems are introduced. This is a part of the story where you start seeing things happen and where suspense and tension is created. The climax is the turning point of the plot, when everything that's been headed in one direction suddenly is headed in another direction. You may have learned that the climax is the most emotional point of the story. That's not the best definition. And the reason why it's not the best definition is that we all react differently to different things. In a story where a dog dies, if you've recently lost a pet, that could very easily be the most emotional part of the story. But in this particular story, it could be a small detail. It might not be related to the main conflict or problem at all. So instead, you should think of climax as a turning point, when up to that moment, things were headed in one direction or unknown, but after that particular moment, they were headed in a different direction or a decision was made. And then falling action is what happens as a direct result of that event or moment. So if somebody makes a decision, it is exactly what happens as a consequence of that decision. If it's a physical climax where there's a fight and somebody gets the upper hand and defeats someone, it might be that they have to escape afterwards to avoid being caught. It might be that people cheer and are very supportive. It is the thing that happens in the direct moments that follow the climax. And then the resolution is the ending or final statement. It's the establishment of a new status quo. That sounds kind of fancy, but what that really just means is that the resolution is where they explain at the end that there's a new normal. For example, if at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, in the exposition, we learn that Dorothy is kind of unhappy living with her Aunt Em and wishes for something grander and wants to run away and finds her life kind of tedious. Then at the end of The Wizard of Oz, after she's had her adventure and winds up back in Kansas with her family, the new normal, or the resolution, is that actually she's very grateful for her family and she loves and appreciates them and realizes, of course, that there is no place like home. Okay? When we talk about plot, we often talk about drawing plot lines. And if you've seen a plot line before, you've probably seen something like the one on the left, where you'd have the exposition, the rising action, and here's the climax, here's the falling action, and here's the resolution. I think a more accurate way to draw a plot line is the one on the right. And here's why. First of all, I think you can see that the rising action contains a few mini points of climax, moments where you can tell there's some heightened tension, there is a potential for a turning point, but it doesn't actually happen. Think of a good mystery movie or an action adventure. The detective or sleuth or police officer never catches the suspect right away. There's usually somebody that you think is the perpetrator that turns out to be innocent. Or there's a chase and you think you're going to get him, but he gets away. So all of those smaller moments of excitement are represented by these smaller peaks. There's still one highest moment. There's definitely a climax. But then the other thing that I think is true or better about this plotline is that the falling action and resolution happen much faster. There's not as much of them, and you don't really return to the same emotional point that you started at. Think about the last big blockbuster you saw, probably a big action-adventure movie. After the climax, the biggest battle between the good guys and the villains, or the biggest chase, or whatever, there's not a lot of movie left. We tend to deal with falling action and climaxes pretty quickly. So I think that this also shows that there's not as much of them. You can use either one as long as you understand that it's not totally linear and smooth like the ones you're used to. Another key element to good stories is conflict. Conflict is the problem in the story that drives the plot. If there were no problems in the story, it wouldn't be very interesting, and it wouldn't have many opportunities to teach us anything or make any observations about life. So every story has at least one conflict. Good stories and long stories often have more than one. When we talk about conflicts, we talk about them in terms of types. And there are 5 major types of conflict. The first is person versus person. Person versus person conflicts describe competitions. When one or more people are in competition for something of personal value, like money, or even a romantic object, or a prize, or a contest, or even honor. That's a person versus person conflict. Some good examples are sports movies. Often, if there's a long rivalry between teams and they just want to win a game, that's a person versus person conflict. And note that even though in a football team example there's more than one person, because what they're competing for is just for personal gain, it is still considered a person versus person conflict. Every love triangle story is a person versus person conflict because 2 people are vying for the affection of one other. A person versus self conflict is different. It's instead of when somebody's in competition with someone else, a person versus self conflict represents a problem someone's having when they have a big choice to make or are deciding what kind of person to be. These are what we call internal conflicts, and they're very common in young adult novels because any story about growing up or coming of age is a person versus self conflict. A lot of good stories have an element of this, even if the main conflict is something else, because whenever you really delve into a character's inner thoughts, or if you see a character really struggling with the choice, that's a person versus self conflict. A good example comes from some of the later Hunger Games stories, when Katniss isn't really sure if she wants to be or lead the rebellion, if she wants to sort of do her own thing, if she's had enough of everything. But Katniss and the Hunger Games represent an even better example of a person versus society conflict. Because a person versus society conflict is a conflict in which somebody has a problem with the rules of a society or an institution. Be very careful. It is not just the same as when a person has a problem with a group of people. Sometimes people get confused and think society means person versus more than one person. That's not true. Person versus society has to be about rules or expectations. A lot of person versus society conflicts are dystopian stories like the Hunger Games, where obviously Katniss has a problem with the way that Panem is run and the different districts and the Hunger Games themselves. But also person versus society conflicts can be stories about isms, whether it's racism or sexism or homophobia, because when somebody is rebelling against the expectation someone has for them because they're poor or because they're a woman, that is often a problem they have with the institutions or systems. Lord of the Flies is a good example of a person versus society conflict as well. Person versus nature is the fourth type of conflict, and that one is what it sounds like. It is when a person finds themselves in conflict with nature, something truly natural, like a storm, a fire, the cold, a wild animal. The good examples of these are movies like Twister, or if you're a fan of White Fang, or any of the stories about trying to survive in the wild, into the wild, is a person versus nature conflict as well. And the last type is called person versus fate, or you can also call it person versus God. Whichever you call it, it means exactly the same thing. It is when a person is in conflict with forces completely outside their control. When even though they're doing everything right, they wind up so unlucky that it seems they can't possibly be successful, or when strange things have happened, a series of coincidences perhaps have put them in really unfortunate, bad situations that they have to deal with. There are a few examples of these. They don't all have to be religious. Don't be confused by the God word. But certainly a good example, if you are familiar with religious texts, is Job from the Old Testament being tested by God and having been challenged so many ways. But also Lemony Snicket and the unfortunate events, when you see a lot of coincidences, when you find yourself talking about bad luck a lot, that is very likely a person versus fate conflict. Sometimes person versus fate or God conflicts can also just be about why me. If you read Wonder, it's possible that the character Augie could have wondered, why me? Why, when I was born, did I have a disfiguring disease? Or why was I born in a society that would judge me for that? In fact, Augie's pretty resilient and that doesn't happen. But that kind of why me question, if that's at the heart of the story, it's also very likely a person versus fate or person versus God conflict. Hold on for a second. You're going to have to start the second link to watch your second video.